So the Michael Jackson song, The Man in the Mirror, its relationship to our speaker for us is that he challenges a lot of us to think about who we are, what we believe, and what kind of life are we living. Are we, in fact, trying to have a better resume or a stronger obituary is one of the metaphors that he uses. You see a slide about him. He's been an incredible conscience, really, for not just our country, but the world. Join me in welcoming Mr. David Brooks to MBA.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back here. I was here once before, about 15 years ago, I think. I did a story on Bill Frist and spent some time at MBA, and expect you all to become heart surgeons and senators before you're done. And it's good to be back in high school. I myself was an outstanding high school student. I graduated in the top 80% of my class. I was very proud of that. And I want to thank the singers, wherever they've gone to, for that Michael Jackson. I actually learned to moonwalk a couple of years ago. I'd do it if I had more space here, but I don't. I want to talk to you, something I tell my students. I teach at Yale. I only teach at schools I couldn't have gotten into. And one of the things I tell my students is that 80% of you will be more boring at age 35 than you are now. And I want to talk about that. And the ones who are not more boring at age 35 are the ones who've reflected on their lives, and they basically say, okay, the next 4 years of my life are a chapter. What am I going to do with this chapter? And so what I want to talk to you about was some of the common chapters in a life, some of the common things that happen in people's lives that make them the fullest potential of what they can be. And the first thing I'll tell you, it's what I call the Annunciation Moment. And there was a guy who's a famous scientist at Harvard, he's now about 85, named E.O. Wilson. And when Wilson was 7, his folks were splitting up. And they sent him to a beach in northern Florida called Paradise Beach. And he didn't know the family he was staying with, but he'd have lunch with them and have breakfast with them. But the rest of the time, he just walked along the beach. And while he was walking along the beach, he's 7 years old, he starts seeing stuff he'd never seen before. So he saw a jellyfish, and he said it was beyond my comprehension. He was sitting on a dock one day, and his feet were dangling in the water, and a stingray went down beneath his feet. And he says, I was seized by this desire to investigate and capture these things and understand these things. And at that moment, a naturalist was born. And then when you're discovering what you're going to do with your life, it's not through science. You just find something amazingly beautiful, and you find it compellingly interesting. And so that's the Annunciation Moment. There's some moment that often happens early in your life, though you may not be aware of it at the moment, when some passion, some interest in something is born, and it determines the course of your life. I had it also at age 7. I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided at that instant I wanted to become a writer. And it's been 49 years since, and I've been writing every day just about since then. I remember in high school I wanted to date this woman named Bernice. She didn't want to date me, she wanted to date some other guy. And I was thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. But that was my set of interests. And so the Annunciation Moment often happens at a time of loss in your childhood, and you find something that fills the loss. And the hard part about having an Annunciation Moment is not having it something that really you find cool and absorbing, but realizing, yes, this could be the moment of my life when the whole future of my life is set out. His Annunciation Moment had another chapter, Wilson's did, which is he wanted to become a naturalist. He discovered nature. And he was out fishing one day at that same summer, and he caught a pinfish, and he was taking it off the hook, and it was a little flipping around, and he was a little careless, and it flipped up into his face, and the pin from the dorsal fin pierced his pupil of his right eye. But he didn't want to leave. It was in excruciating pain, but he did not want to leave the beach because he loved the ocean so much. So he went home that night and told the family he was staying with, and they didn't think much of it, but he subsequently lost vision in that eye. And so he could not study fish, he could not study birds, he could only study little things he could hold up to his one good eye, and he studied ants. And he became one of the greatest scientists in the world studying ants and then the rest of science. So it's that moment when a passion is born. The second thing he had was a mentor. He went to the University of Alabama, where he's from, and then he went to Harvard, and he had a mentor named Darlington, who was another biologist. And Darlington gave him advice on how to be a naturalist, how to be a scientist. And one of the things he said was, when you're collecting your samples, don't go on the trail, cut across the jungle. It's harder, but you get better samples. And Darlington, when he was 39, was cutting across the jungle, and he was collecting little beetles, and he went in the Amazon into a pond. And he was on a log in the pond collecting beetles when a crocodile rose up from under the waters, grabbed him, and dragged him down to the bottom of the pond. Chewing up all the right side of his body. Darlington escaped. The crocodile got him again, pulled him back down. He escaped again, and then had to drag himself through the jungle, bleeding profusely from his right side. But what Wilson said was, escaping a crocodile is not a sign of good character. It's what happened next that's the sign of good character. Darlington was in a full body cast for several months, but he learned to drag himself through the jungle in the cast and taught himself how to collect samples just with his left hand. And what that taught Wilson was that life is hard. And what are the things we learn in schools? What's worth wanting? What is so important that I'm willing to tolerate that pain? And I think that's something we all want. When you think of a profession, it's easy to get a profession. It's hard to get a profession that pursue your moral ideals, that you want with all your heart and with all your soul. That's what happiness is wanting one thing in one direction. And that can only be taught if the thing you're chasing is a thing so worthy that it's worth suffering immense pain from. And that was the lesson Wilson got from Darlington, and that's what mentors do, that's what teachers do. They help teach us what's really worth wanting and what's not worth wanting. I had my own mentorship experience, not from a school, not from a person, but from an institution, from a school. My high school was a normal suburban high school, but I went to a remarkable college called the University of Chicago. It's the famous saying about Chicago is it's where fun goes to die. But the better saying is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. It's this intellectually rich place. And we just fought with each other. We were what they call seminar baboons, where we just argued with each other all day. And I went to class a little. Mostly I just stayed in the dining room, and we argued 6-8 hours a day about random stuff. And one of the things I learned at Chicago is a very tremendously valuable trait, which is the ability to see. You think normally, oh, it's easy to see stuff, you just look out and see. But I'm in politics, and people do not see the world accurately, they see what they want to see. And the ability to see is only taught by reading great writers. There's a writer named George Orwell, who I recommend, who I hope some of you have read, C.S. Lewis. The ability to see the world clearly and to know what you've seen and get your own ego out of the way. And then the ability to argue well, to know how strong, to be able to summarize your opponent's argument at depth and then argue against it. And that institution changed my life, and I feel more attached to it now than I did the day I graduated. And I suspect you guys will feel more attached to MBA when you're 55 than you will today. Because what the school does is it plants seeds in you that bloom. And so being receptive to mentorship is the second episode I wanted to describe. The third episode I wanted to describe was the moment you discover that you can conquer fear. Your first year out of college is going to be a bad year. When you're in college, like here, highly intelligent people are paid to read your writing and pretend they find your comments interesting. After you get out of school, that goes away. And your first job's likely going to suck. You're going to have bad bosses. You're going to have romantic breakups. Every time you go in for a job interview, the guy will have that Kanye attitude, there's a million of you, there's only one of me. And so the best advice I've heard on what to do with that first year is to widen your horizon of risk. And at some point in life, you have to do something completely crazy that widens your horizon of risk. And after you do that crazy thing, then forever after, your horizon of risk will be out here. If you never do that crazy thing, it'll be here. So I had a friend who was at UVA, and she graduated and she applied for this program I hope you've heard of called Teach for America. And she didn't get in. So she Googled Teach Abroad. And some guy in Korea said, I'm in this fishing village in Korea, we need a teacher, would you like to be our teacher? So she told her parents that she had some big involved program with a lot of supervision, but it was really just a guy in Korea. She flies out there, and she flies to a little airport in southern Korea, and she gets to the airport, and she doesn't speak any Korean, doesn't know anything about the country, and she gets there at about 11 at night, and there's nobody there to greet her. And she, sort of panicking, she sits outside, and it's now 1 in the morning, and there's only one other person in the airport, this monk, and he's sitting on the bench next to her. They can't speak. He leaves. And then at 2 in the morning, the lights go out, and she's sitting there in the dark in a strange country in a place she's knows nothing about. And then at 3 in the morning, a van pulls up with 5 Korean guys, and they say, "Are you our teacher?" And she says, "Yeah." And and they say, "Get in the van." Now, if my daughter did this, I would kill her. But she got in the van and spent the next 19 months teaching at this strange place in a strange country, far away from everything she ever knew. And as a result of that experience, she could then know anything else that comes my way, I can conquer that moment. And so that's the third moment I wanted to talk about. The fourth moment I wanted to talk about is what hits a lot of my former students, my former Yale students, when they're 24 and 25. And I call it a Telos Crisis. They get to school, they go to a lot of them go to really fine high schools like this one. They went to a really fine college. They're really good at getting into things. And they try to make life into high school. School is station to station. When you're at school, everything is determined by what the next thing you have to do is. The next paper, the next test, the next application process. So they try to make life like that. I'll apply to go to this prestigious company. I'll try to go to this prestigious graduate school. It's just they want to preserve it station to station because I'm really good at getting into things. And then they have one major setback and everything collapses because they have never asked themselves this question: what am I actually called to do? They don't know what their purpose in life is. And Nietzsche has a phrase that he who has a why to live for can endure any how. He who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. If you know why you're on this earth, all the setbacks are manageable because you know what your long-term goal is. But if you don't know why, then every setback is just a crushing defeat. And I see it happen over and over again to my students in their mid-20s. And they just have to start over because they've never asked that question, what actually am I called for? And that's because the system we're all educated in trains us to think station to station. But to find your purpose requires an entirely different set of navigational skills, not what's the next station, but what's the ultimate end on the far horizon of my life, and what was I called to do. And when I wrote a book that some of you may have read parts of called The Road to Character, and it was about how the key to good character is identifying and defeating the core weakness in yourself. So for some of my characters, they were cowardly, for some they were vague, vain, some they were emotionally fragmented, and they woke up every night or went to bed every night and said, you know, what's the core weakness of my life? And what can I do every day to defeat my core weakness? And that's how they built their character. But one of the things I didn't appreciate about the characters when I was writing the book was they all had amazing moms. Their dads were like, but their moms were amazing. And I came across a study that was done of men who were drafted into the Army in World War II. And some of those men in the war rose to become majors and colonels, and some stayed privates. And they did a study, what correlates with success in the Army in wartime? What are the traits that those people have? And they looked at the men who rose and became colonels and majors, and they checked out, was IQ the thing that correlated with success? No relationship. Was it socioeconomic status? No relationship. Was it physical courage and strength? No relationship. The number one correlation with success in the Army in times of combat was relationship with mother. That the guys who had received a vast flood of love and joy from their mom were able to give it to their men. And they were able to make profound commitments to their men. And so the things we think are soft and squishy, a loving relationship, are actually hard even in times of combat. And so I realized that the book I had written was a bit incomplete. And the next moment I want to talk about is what I'm spending my time thinking about, which is commitment making. Commitment making is falling in love with something and then developing a habit of behavior for those moments when love falters. And most of you in this room, at some time over the next 20 years or 15 years, are going to make 4 big commitments: to a spouse and a family, to a philosophy or faith, to a vocation, and to a community. And the fulfillment of your lives will depend on how well you choose and execute on those commitments. And you're getting practice in that right now. Whether you're on the football team, whether you're singing, whether you're on any activity here or in the classroom, it's a commitment you're making. A commitment is just a promise. You're making a promise to a group of other people, and then you get tested by how well you fulfill your promises. And life is about promise making. Every day you're making promises. And so the 2 things I'll close with you are, to me, the 2 things that are hardest to appreciate in a world like this. And as I say, I teach at a competitive school. You go to a competitive school. And a lot of you, especially who are juniors and seniors, I'm sure 80% of your adult conversations are, where are you going to college? And so the pressure is always toward career success. And it's always toward amputating the part of yourself that's the deepest part of yourself. And those are 2 things. One is your moral conscience. I ran into a guy who he bought a house, and there was he had a driveway, and next to the driveway was this bamboo tree. And he hated bamboo, so he chopped it down, and he took an axe to it, to what was left of the roots, and chopped it all up. And then he poured poison into the hole. Then he poured gravel on top of the poison, and then he covered it up with concrete, because he hated bamboo. 2 years later, the bamboo shoot is shooting up through the driveway. And that's your moral conscience. You can try to cover it over with career success and anything else, but it won't go away. It'll keep shooting you up, and if you haven't answered its call, you'll be miserable. The second thing to be mentioned, and I'm glad it's being emphasized here, is emotion. A lot of us guys are not comfortable talking about emotion. My friends say that me talking about emotion is like Gandhi talking about gluttony. It's like not my natural thing. But emotional intimacy, the capacity for emotional intimacy, is the key to commitment making, the key to being open and communicative with other human beings. And basically, when you're making a commitment to another person, whether it's a friend, or whether it's an eventual spouse, or whether it's to a team, basically what you're doing is successive vulnerability. So you're like 2 trees growing next to each other, and if you're vulnerable with one another, the roots of the 2 trees grow together underground, and you have the firmest possible bond. And so to me, we're mostly guys in this room, and we have a tendency to think that the things that are public, the career success, the grade success, the athletic success, are those are where the prizes are. But the key to a successful life is being open to the more mushy and emotional things. And then the final question I would ask you with 2 final questions I'll leave you with. The first is, I had a friend who was at a job interview, and at the end of the interview, he was the one being interviewed. He turned to the questioner, and he said to her, "What would you do if you weren't afraid?" And she broke down crying, because if she wasn't afraid, she wouldn't be in that job. And every year I ask my Yale students, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And frankly, every year 2 or 3 of them say, well, if I weren't afraid, I wouldn't be at Yale, because I don't like it here. But the brand is too fancy, so I can't give it up. That's one question I would ask. The second question I would leave you with, and the final one, is what's the central challenge of your time? Some of you probably have heard of Elon Musk. When he was in high school, he asked himself, what's the central challenge of my time? And he came up with 3 answers: the internet, environmental degradation, and space exploration. So Elon Musk founded PayPal, he founded Tesla, and he founded SpaceX. Pretty good. But he asked himself that question in high school, and the rest of his life was answering the question. And so I'm just going to throw out one answer to the question, I think, for your generation. And partly it's to clean up the mess left by my generation. The central challenge of my time, of your time, in my view, is we have a crisis of social fragmentation. We don't have bonds with each other across classes, across race, across politics. And so we've all become way too isolated from one another. And my generation has helped weaken the social fabric and rip it apart, and your generation will be in charge of reweaving the social fabric and creating friendships with people completely unlike yourself. And the health of America will be dependent on how well you do that. Thank you.